Massachusetts Bay was settled by non-separating Congregationalists. Their purpose was to create an example of a godly Congregationalist state. On the voyage to New England, the leader of the group, John Winthrop, preached a sermon on their main ship, the Arbella. And in that sermon, he said that Puritans were going to America to found a city on a hill, a shining example of a Christian Puritan commonwealth, a state, if you will, on a mission from God, an example for mankind in general and for England in particular. The Puritans proposed to take the true English religion, that is Puritanism, out of England and save it for when God might decide to punish England for its sins. Then they would return to England and found a Puritan commonwealth there. They believed that they would survive pure and true in the American wilderness while England received punishment from God for their many sins. Then they would return to introduce the true faith to England. They believed that God held the entire community responsible for individual sin, and they also believed that the end was near for merry old England, that soon God would punish the English people for their sins. The leader of the Massachusetts Bay experiment, John Winthrop, and the government of Massachusetts felt that they had to enforce their religion in order to create and maintain a Bible commonwealth. They closed political participation only to visible saints, that is, who had been elected to predestination for grace. Winthrop was afraid that if strangers were permitted to participate in government, the Bible Commonwealth would surely vanish. The Massachusetts government could not pass a law that said that only saints could vote or hold office, but they could say that only church members could vote and hold office. After all, in England, only church members voted. The difference, of course, was that everybody born in England was automatically a member of the Anglican Church. In Massachusetts, only those who believed they had found grace were allowed to be full church members. Since there was only one church, the Congregationalist, in the colony, and since only saints could be members of the Congregationalist churches, essentially that meant that only Congregationalists could vote, which John Winthrop was okay with because he believed that every Congregationalist in the Massachusetts community would agree with his utopian vision. So in effect, Massachusetts civil rights were tied to the Congregationalist church membership, and thus the Commonwealth of Massachusetts was ruled exclusively by Puritan saints. Winthrop and the other leaders of the Massachusetts experiment also had no intention of letting England interfere in any way with their colony. When the Puritans left England, they took the Massachusetts Bay Company charter with them so that the headquarters of the company wouldn't be in London, which was usually the case. It would be in Boston, which gave the leaders of the Massachusetts Bay Company in Massachusetts relatively complete control over the colony without any interference from England. Winthrop and his colleagues would go through any required form so long as the real power in the colony resided in Massachusetts. When necessary, the English flag would be pulled out of the closet, hoisted above the State House, just long enough for a Navy ship to see it, and then taken down and put back in the closet. The leaders of Massachusetts sent letters of loyalty to whoever they thought needed to receive them in England, but they really did as they pleased, or I probably should say, they did as God pleased. Same thing to them. In religious terms, their plan succeeded so well that it failed. In order to explain that remark, I need to talk a little bit about some basic ideas about Protestantism in general and Congregationalism in particular. An important idea of Protestantism is that each Christian should read the Scriptures and interpret the Scriptures for themselves. Another important idea is that the Bible is the revealed Word of God. These two ideas create a dilemma for organized religion. If the Bible is the revealed truth, then there really isn't much need for interpretation. So if I interpret the Bible in a specific way, since it's from the Bible and thus absolute truth, I must be right. And anybody who disagrees with me must be terribly wrong. So long as an established church hierarchy, say the Anglican Church or the Roman Catholic Church, interprets and requires belief from its members, there's no problem. This was the case with the Church of England and with Roman Catholics, and even to some extent with Presbyterians. But the central idea of Congregationalism is that each congregation is independent. Each congregation is expected to interpret theology for itself. In England, where the Congregationalists were a permanent, persecuted minority, there was no real problem. But once independent churches became free in the Massachusetts wilderness, some began to develop new ideas. Some congregations began to shift their theology, shift their doctrine, shift their ideas. Some congregations began to dissent from Winthrop and his colleagues. If all the churches began to find their own way, then the solidarity of the Massachusetts Bay community would be broken. The Puritan utopian experiment would fail, and the city on a hill becomes figuratively a series of unconnected villages, a collection of strangers in a strange land. But for Massachusetts to force the churches of the colony to conform violated the very idea of congregational independence. That is, the very idea on which Congregationalism is founded. If Winthrop and company attempted to impose doctrine, to impose unity on the churches, then Winthrop would be just as guilty of destroying the utopia as the dissenting churches. So the Massachusetts government developed a different way to deal with dissent. And one historian, Edmund Morgan, has called this way the New England way. The New England way of dealing with dissent included the following. First, if somebody falls away from the utopian path, somebody begins to differ in their theology, especially a minister or pastor, informal meetings are held among the ministers to try to iron out differences and bring the erring minister or individual of a particular church back to the fold. Second, a formal meeting of senior ministers who point out the errors to the dissenter and demand that the offending person, church, or minister conform. Third, if all else fails, the civil authorities took the appropriate measure to either force conformity or expel the nonconformists. Now, what we're going to do next is examine a couple of cases of extreme nonconformism that would become extraordinarily troublesome to John Winthrop in the early colonial period, in the 1630s particularly. One of them was a pastor from England named Roger Williams, and the other was a woman named Anne Hutchinson. Roger Williams was a dissenting Puritan minister who had been chased out of England by the Anglicans and was initially welcomed with open arms into Massachusetts in 1631. He was a superstar, a celebrity, one of the great pastors of the Puritan movement. So people in Massachusetts were wowed when Roger Williams appeared in Boston in 1631. But Williams quickly became rather disturbing in Massachusetts as well. He began, first off, I should say, he was given guest sermon gigs in all of the important churches in the Boston area. Oh, wow, we have Roger Williams. And he began to make sermons in the important churches in that town. With disturbing effect, I should add. He began to announce, first, that New England Puritans were living in sin and practicing false doctrine. Williams argued that the Bible didn't really offer a blueprint for government. It wasn't a constitution, it was a spiritual how-to book, if you will. And so church and state should be separate. Worse, Williams stated that the magistrates may not punish any sort of breach of the first table of the Ten Commandments, such as idolatry or Sabbath breaking or false worship, and that no one should be compelled to go to church. Now, even though only the saints could vote in church activities, only they had civil and, if you will, church rights, everybody in Massachusetts had to attend church on Sunday. Everybody. That was in the law. But Winthrop stated, and I quote, that forced worship stinks in God's nostrils. Forced worship stinks in God's nostrils. It's one of my favorite phrases in American history. He also began to argue that the Indians had been cheated of their land in two ways, essentially. First, he questioned whether the Indians weren't better off with their own traditional religion. That is, he questioned whether or not it was appropriate to attempt to convert them. Second, he questioned whether the New England landowners had any right to their land at all. It was stolen, he said, from the Native Americans. Now, the people of New England, the people to whom he preached, said, no, that's not true. We got this land in a grant from the king. And Williams asked, well, how did he acquire it? He said, at worst, you're thieves. At best, you are receivers of stolen goods. How could the king give the people of Massachusetts what wasn't his to give? Well, the Boston leaders were pretty worried about Williams, but they decided that his ideas were so wacky that no congregation could possibly want to hire him. Invitations for Williams to do guest gigs began to shrink up. Nobody wanted him preaching this crazy stuff from their pulpit, especially in and around Boston. It looked like Williams would be silenced. But then, in August of 1634, the congregation of the church at Salem, Massachusetts, hired Williams to become their pastor. Williams preached his wacky stuff relentlessly from the Salem pulpit. Boston leaders annoyed at Williams' brassness, but there was not much they could do about it. They were unable to make any decisive action against Williams because he had his own church, and they couldn't go up against congregational independence. If they let Williams keep preaching, they risked the destruction of their utopian project. As people began to agree with the renegade Williams, problems became even worse. Then Boston got the opportunity to act in the matter. In a dispute between Massachusetts Bay and the Salem colony regarding the possession of a piece of land claimed by Salem, the court, probably under the advice of John Winthrop, offered to grant the land to Salem, but only under the condition that Salem fire its pastor, Roger Williams. The fact is, this act should have made Winthrop's blood run cold. The offer he made was either stand by your minister, adhere to the idea of congregationalism, or go for the gold. What will you have? Independence and righteousness, or land? Politics or religious principle? Salem opted for the land and fired Williams. Once Williams was cut loose from his church, the colonial government could deal with him and did. They expelled Williams from the colony. Now, Roger Williams went back to Britain, got a charter of his own, and returned to America to found the Rhode Island colony. Williams would trade goods for land with the Native Americans in Rhode Island, and so he would found also a colony in which there was just the opposite of Massachusetts, in which there was nearly complete freedom of conscience. Anyone could come to Rhode Island. Anyone could come to Rhode Island as long as they weren't Roman Catholics. From 1634 to about 1640, hundreds of thousands of Puritans migrated from England to New England. This period is called the period of the Great Migration. Now, one of those migrants who arrived in Boston in 1634 was Anne Hutchinson. She settled in Boston. Several people from the ship that she arrived in told some of the Massachusetts leaders that she had expressed some rather odd ideas on the ship. A minister who had traveled on the ship even recommended to Winthrop that she should be put back on the next ship to England and as soon as possible. Several ministers examined her when she arrived in Boston. Her knowledge of Scripture was truly impressive. But shortly, and she said just the right things to impress the authorities with her orthodoxy. But shortly after settling in at Boston, she began to hold Bible readings, Bible meetings in her home. Now, this was a popular thing to do in England where the Puritans were an oppressed minority, but it wasn't really done much in Massachusetts because, after all, the Puritans were the majority. Nevertheless, Hutchinson began to hold Bible meetings in her home, which became very popular in Boston. And in these meetings, Hutchinson began to say some fairly troubling things. First, she began to teach that when a person had received grace, the Holy Spirit entered them and spoke directly to them and kept them on a path of righteousness. Now, as you'll see in the lecture material, this heresy is called antinomianism. Election, she said, essentially offered a saint a sort of hotline to God. Now, this was contrary to Calvinist teachings, and Hutchinson began to complain that God had told her that only 2 ministers in Massachusetts were saved, and all the rest were strangers. That is, they had not found grace, and thus were damned and shouldn't be behind a pulpit. She became a threat to the Bible Commonwealth, a person who has the Holy Spirit handy to tell them that they are saved already, doesn't really need ministers or organized religion, a congregation, or a government to tell them how to behave or worship. Winthrop saw this as a threat of enormous proportions. Hutchinson had the support from the merchant communities on the coast. The government, not the market, controlled prices in New England. If you take too big a profit, this hurts the community and therefore it's sinful. Prices were strictly regulated. Profits of more than 10% were not acceptable. To overcharge was both a crime and a sin, so a merchant who charged too much could expect both civil punishment and damnation. As more people arrived in the colonies during the Great Migration, and the amount of goods remained relatively limited, prices began to rise rather rapidly. Merchants were caught in the middle between the demands of outraged consumers and an inflating economy. Hutchinson offered them a way out. Hutchinson said that works, that is, doing good things, has nothing to do with sin, which only requires faith and the inner promptings of the Holy Spirit. So God doesn't care if you make profits or not. The merchants liked this message. Farmers and other consumers were considerably less well pleased, and they liked it better when God was on their side. Hutchinson thus triggered not only a theological rift, but also a social one. Winthrop and some of the other ministers went through the roof. Hutchinson was dragged before the ministers of Boston and the magistrates several times, and generally argued circles around them. Ultimately, Hutchinson and her followers, some 5 or 6 church loads, were banished from Massachusetts. They settled in Rhode Island. As a result of these exiles, what rapidly was growing up in Massachusetts was the notion that any congregation could believe any doctrines that they felt were right, so long as they were the same as those accepted by Winthrop and the Massachusetts religious leadership. Now, at the beginning of the settlement in Massachusetts, the Winthrop and others believed very firmly that one of their missions was to convert the local native peoples to Congregationalist Christianity. As the saying went, to turn them into praying Indians. Now, that missionary effort to convert the natives turned rapidly into a land grab. As more and more English people began to arrive on the shores of Massachusetts, more and more land was needed. Massachusetts leaders often told the Indians that if they wanted to avoid war, they should disarm, and when they did so, they would enslave them and sell them off to the Spanish. The best example of these relations was the war that began in 1875 between the colonists and a tribe of natives called the Wampanoag. The Wampanoag's dependence upon English manufactured goods led them into an ever-increasing process of land trades, resulting ultimately in further resentment and tension. In 1875, 3 tribal members were tried and executed by the English for the murder of several Wampanoag praying Indians, that is, Christian converts. And this touched off more than a year of hostilities called King Philip's War. Beginning in June of 1675, the Wampanoag, outfitted with rifles and armor, attacked a series of settlements and took the lives of dozens of colonial men, women, and children. English forces retaliated by destroying native villages and slaughtering the inhabitants. Soon other tribes, including the Narragansett, joined the fray, and the entire region fell into conflict. Now, the tide turned in 1676 when the Narragansett were decisively defeated and their chief killed. Hostilities ground to a halt. A few months later, when Philip was captured and killed, his corpse was drawn and quartered and his severed head placed on a stake to be paraded through Plymouth Colony. Philip's son was sold into slavery in Bermuda. The tribe itself collapsed, and many other captives were forced into servitude throughout New England. The tribe essentially disappeared. The colonists had prevailed in King Philip's War, but the cost was tremendous. It would be more than 2 decades before all of the devastated frontier settlements could be reoccupied, and longer still before they began further expansion to the west. The New England Native Americans had been decimated to the extent that their impact on future events would be almost non-existent. By the late 1650s, it became clear to Puritan ministers and leaders that church membership was declining rapidly because the new generation of Massachusetts youth were no longer having religious experiences that would allow them to declare themselves members of the elect and therefore church members. Now, the steady decline in church membership was not only a religious danger, but also a political one, because church membership was required in order to be involved in the politics of the colonies. Ministers were concerned for their congregations, and the colonial leaders began to worry over the possible dissolution of their Bible utopia. In 1662, ministers in Boston came up with a way to cope with the problem, which is called the Halfway Covenant. Puritans, who felt that people of their colonies were drifting away from their original religious purpose, came up with an idea that would allow people a sort of a halfway membership in the church. The children of full members could become half members. They would not be allowed to take part in church activities other than attending church, of course, which everybody had to do, but they would be allowed to vote for members of the Massachusetts General Assembly, called the General Court of Massachusetts. So this became a way with dealing of the political and religious problems that were causing trouble in Massachusetts. The first generation settlers were beginning to die out, while their children and grandchildren often expressed less religious piety and more desire for material wealth. Now, in 1685, a new king came to the throne of England. His name was James II. He was the brother of Charles II and one of the sons of Charles I. Now, James was a practicing Roman Catholic, which made him unpopular in England, and James had a problem with the northern part of the American colonies. the Upper East, the Northeast, and the American colonies. His problem was this. The southern colonies produced enormous quantities of raw materials from which James derived financial income. They produced cotton in small quantities. They produced tobacco in vast quantities. They produced all kinds of goods that were exported to England and taxed, and then exported as finished products from England to the continent and taxed. But the Northeast, especially New England, produced virtually nothing that was taxable, nothing that would give revenues to James II. Now, James didn't really know much about the geography of New England, but what he did know was he wanted to get more taxes from New England. And he decided that the best way to do that would be to create a sort of a super colony, a larger colony that could be more easily controlled and that he could derive more profit from. In other words, he thought that the New Englanders were cheating, and so he could reduce the cheating by more efficient government. In 1686, in an attempt to make the colonies in North America more efficient and more profitable, James II created the Dominion of New England. It comprised the 5 New England colonies, plus the province of New York and New Jersey. James chose as his governor for this new super colony an old hand in colonial administration, the former New York governor, Sir Edmund Andros. Andros was an old hand in colonial politics and government. He had been the governor of New York for some years when James had owned New York as the sole proprietor of the colony. Now, the government of this super colony itself consisted entirely of the governor, Andros, and a council made up of mostly non-New Englanders. There was a New Yorker there, but most of the members of the council had been sent over by James II from England. Some of them were even Roman Catholics. Put simply, Massachusetts under this new rule would be entirely governed by strangers. Not only strangers in a religious sense, because most of them were either Anglican or Catholic, but strangers in a political sense too, because only 1 or 2 of them actually came from New England. Andros further complicated matters. When he arrived in Boston Harbor, he informed the local ministers that he would expect them to lend him one of their Congregationalist churches for Easter services, Anglican Easter services. The saints of Boston were scandalized. Andros demanded that Anglican church services be held in a Congregationalist church. The Congregationalist members of the church tried to keep him out, but services were held there for Anglican communicants for the next year. At the same time, Anglicans, an increasing number of them had settled in Boston. Anglicans began to build their own Anglican chapel in the city of Boston itself. In 1688, England underwent something called the Glorious Revolution. We'll talk a little more about it later. And the folks in Massachusetts hosted a revolution of their own. They arrested Andros and his cronies, who were sent back to England, where they were tried for treason, and I should mention acquitted, for nearly 4 years. Massachusetts, which reverted back to an independent colony, had no charter, had no relationship to the king from 1688 to 1692. And it's during that period that Massachusetts goes through some pretty dreadful conditions. William III came to the throne of England. James escaped to France. And in order to make William happy, the people in Massachusetts engaged in a war called King William's War against the French in Canada and lost heavily. Things began to get worse and worse in the colony. Colonial ministers began to teach sermons in which they argued that the colony had fallen upon evil ways, the colonists had violated their covenant with God, and bad times were coming to New England. Some of these Jeremiads, as they're called, these sermons, predicted that evil would walk among the people of Massachusetts. The devil, they said, would walk the highways and byways of the colony. In the village of Salem in 1692, indeed it seemed that the devil had arrived. Betty Paris, age 9, and her cousin Abigail Williams, age 11, the daughter and niece, respectively, of the Reverend Samuel Paris, the Salem pastor, fell victim to what was recorded as fits beyond the power of epileptic fits or natural disease to affect. According to John Hale, a minister in Beverly, in his book A Modest Inquiry into the Nature of Witchcraft, the girls screamed, threw things about the room, uttered strange sounds, crawled under the furniture, and contorted themselves into peculiar positions. When Paris attempted to pray or preach over them, they complained of being pricked with pins or cut with knives. They would cover their ears as if dreading to hear Paris's words. When a doctor couldn't explain what was happening to them, he said the girls had been bewitched. Others in the village began to exhibit the same symptoms. The Salem authorities decided that witchcraft was at work here, that the devil had indeed walked abroad in Salem, and they began to investigate the possible causes of the affliction of the girls. The girls were most helpful in pointing out individuals that they maintained had afflicted them by means of witchcraft. The first 3 people accused were arrested for allegedly afflicting Ann Putnam Jr., age 12. Sarah Good was a beggar, Sarah Osborne, a bedridden old woman, and Tituba, a slave. Tituba, as a slave, had a different ethnicity than the Puritans. She was the obvious target for accusations. Sarah Good, a poverty-worn, easily angered woman, often muttered under her breath as she walked away from failed attempts at obtaining food or shelter from her neighbors, and people interpreted her muttering as curses. Sarah Osborne was an irritable old woman who had a difficulty getting along with pretty much anybody she ran into, and so she was a good target as well. All of these women fit the description of the usual suspects, largely disliked and unsupported in the community. Additionally, neither Osborne nor Good attended church, which made them especially vulnerable to accusations of witchcraft. These women were brought before the local magistrates on the complaint of witchcraft on March the 1st, 1692, and held in prison. Other accusations followed in March and April. All told, over 60 persons were arrested and would be tried for witchcraft in Salem. By the time the hysteria had spent itself, 24 people had died, 19 were hanged, and some died in prison. Giles Corey at first pleaded not guilty to charges of witchcraft, but then subsequently refused to enter any plea at his trial. This refusal meant that he could not be convicted legally. However, the examiners chose to subject him to further interrogation by placing stone weights on his body. He survived this brutal torture for 2 days before dying without ever giving a plea. As the trials took place and the members of the accused increased, or I should say the numbers of the accused increased, the conservative Puritan leadership in Boston began to take increasingly greater notice. Here was proof positive, they said, that the people of Massachusetts had strayed and the devil was abroad in the colony. The council in Boston appointed Judge Samuel Sewell and Judge William Stoughton, both conservative council members, to go to Salem and take over the trials. Under Sewell and Stoughton, the Salem court began to employ something called spectral evidence. Spectral evidence is testimony about dreams and visions accepted as evidence in court. Now, in English common law, spectral evidence was not allowed, could not be used as evidence. And as news of the proceedings in Salem became more and more well known in London, colonial agents who were trying to get a new charter from the new king, William III, were increasingly flustered and frustrated. The folks in London looked at the Puritan trial in Salem and believed that it was perfect indication of how wrong-headed the Puritans were. Finally, in late 1692, a new charter was procured for the colony of Massachusetts, and William III named a new governor, Sir William Phips, a Massachusetts native himself. He was sent to Massachusetts with the new charter, and among his first acts as governor was to inform the court in Salem that spectral evidence would no longer be permitted. Now, without spectral evidence, the judges had no evidence at all beyond the antics and screams of 3 badly behaved young women, and the trials ended, and those defendants who had not been convicted were set free. The Salem witchcraft controversy had been written about by more historians than almost any other aspect of the American colonial experience. And you may want to read a page or so in the online lectures that cover the historiography of the witch trials. After the new charter and new government was established, the colony began to become a tremendous commercial success, if you will, a sure sign of God's favor. By 1670, most Puritans were no longer concerned about taking the true faith back to England. They were much more concerned about getting their own house in order. The 1692 colonial charter ended the Massachusetts theocracy. It required that all Protestant freeholders of the colony have full civil rights, even Anglicans. The charter created a colonial government presided over by a royal governor assigned by the king and a council elected by the Massachusetts Assembly and, of course, the Assembly itself. It ended Massachusetts' independence and brought the colony closer to British control. It also made Massachusetts more like pretty much every other royal colony. In 1700, The colony had begun to reproduce the class system of urban England. Um, the wealthy trade aristocrats began to leave the Puritan church in favor of the Anglican church because it was a good business move. Even the Puritans began to aim their talents away from godly pursuits toward commercial, scientific, and secular ones. In short, the Puritans of New England had made a transition to the Yankees of New England. Business people, importers and exporters, manufacturers, and shopkeepers. Religion was no longer the fundamental cause of the colony.